Vi är spelskaparna.
Välkommen till Spelskaparna, podcasten om personerna bakom spelen. The guest today is the game designer Shailesh Prabhu, who also was here in episode 163, where we talked about AAA versus indie game development. Today we're going to talk about game development in India. Shailesh lives in Malmö nowadays, but he used to run a game studio back in India. Welcome.
Thank you for having me again.
Yeah, it's only a few people who have been on more than once.
Oh, thank you. I'm honored.
Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Great. So first question, later we're going to talk more about Indian game development in general, but let's start off with you. How did you end up starting a game studio back in India?
I think I was 13 years old when I played Day of the Tentacle, and I saw the beautiful credit sequence in that game, in the opening of that game. And I had played games before, but my 13-year-old self hadn't realized until that point that, people actually do this for a living. And like, I had that very clear moment where I was like, maybe I want to make games when I grow up. And I tried different things, like a little bit of like, tried to learn art and I studied computer engineering, but like throughout like trying to find my way into the industry, because there's no like games education in India. I just reading about it on the internet, I came across like game design, and like in whatever teams I ended up in, I somehow ended up in that kind of role and like teaching and learning by doing and teaching from the internet and stuff. So I ended up in a group of people which set up the studio for a then small company, which is now quite big. And we did all the production work there. And I found myself doing design, production, QA, a little bit QA management, QA, a lot of other things that nobody was doing, also marketing and publisher relations and everything. So at some point I realized I was doing pretty much everything on the list of things you do when you have your studio. But at the same time, I also felt like the kind of games we were working on, and they weren't super interesting. We were mostly doing like 3D mobile stuff at the time, early days. And so I kind of thought that I should be doing this for myself, and like we can do more interesting games that we wanted to actually make. And so me and a friend from university who was also working with me at this company, we set off on starting our own company. And we started working on a point-and-click adventure game for the Nintendo DS. And we got a publisher, and then that publisher went bankrupt in 2007. And then we pivoted to phone games. And yeah, I mean, I ran that company for 9 years and 9 months. It was a fun run. Yeah.
And what was the setup? Did you have an office or?
Yeah, it was like I was fortunate enough to be, I was living with my mother at the time in my family home, and we had a fairly big place for just the two of us. So we had like a downstairs area which was connected to the street, and like the home was kind of disconnected from it a little bit. So I repurposed that area to become our studio, and we worked out of there. So literally not really from a basement, but it was like from a floor in my then home. Yeah.
Okay. And then this is in Bombay?
Yeah, in Mumbai, yeah. In Bombay.
Yeah, Mumbai, yeah.
Now it's called Mumbai.
Yeah. I just realized. And your mom was almost part of the studio in a way.
Yes and no. I mean, she was supportive, but she didn't really understand what I do. She still doesn't really understand what I do. Yeah.
And so you had already worked for one other game company?
2 actually. 3 actually. Yeah.
3 actually. Yeah. And all of them were in Mumbai?
Yes. No, one was in Bangalore.
And for the listeners, if they don't know about Bangalore is like, there are a lot of huge cities in India. It's the most populous country in the world nowadays. But Bangalore is one of the big cities, which is also famous for its tech scene, right?
Yeah.
And like Microsoft and Adobe and a lot of companies have offices there, but is it also like big on games?
It's not that big on games. There are some studios there, but it's not. I wouldn't say like it's the hub in the same way that it is the hub for software. But honestly, I would struggle to pick a hub for games in India. I don't know which one it would be, because it's very fragmented and there's like a bunch of studios all over the place.
Okay, got it. But when you ran this studio, when it comes to like game development community, did you know of any other people in the area or did you have contact with other Indian game developers at that time?
Yeah, so when I started off the studio, I think there were 3 or 4 other studios in India that people generally knew of that were doing games. And they were kind of like semi-big-ish companies. I think it was just around the time the big indie wave happened, like just before maybe. So it's like there weren't so many like small teams or indie teams that I knew of at the time. There were some mid to big sized companies or companies that had, or like mid-sized companies that had backing from massive companies, things like that. But, and I knew some people there, like not a lot, but then that was about it. It was a very sparse scene back in those days. This is 2005, 2006.
Got it. And were they like making games for any particular platform?
I think at the time there was like 1 or 2 productions in India that was for PC or console, mostly PC, I think. But largely it was mobile centric, but mostly like what we used to then call feature phones, like pre-smartphones.
Yeah.
Like Java and Brew. Yeah, it was like another C++ based operating system.
Okay, got it. Yeah.
For mobile phones, like
Engage, maybe.
Yeah, there were some Engage games also being made.
Yeah, the old Nokia gaming phone. Okay, cool. And like, what was the market like? Very international, or was it more towards India or Asia or something like that?
In those days?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think in those days it was kind of, there were like some people trying to make games for the local market, but a lot of people were trying to do services or like end-to-end development for like overseas clients, like client work and stuff. And then very few people, I don't really know if there was anybody else doing like games that were targeted towards, like a more global audience, I guess. I don't think there was that much of that.
What about your studio?
Yeah, so that's what we felt like, because at that time, we looked at like PC and console penetration in India was abysmally bad in those days. And like feature phones were very restrictive to make games on. Like these are phones that were before smartphones, so they were not very powerful. You could do some games, but it was very restrictive in what you could do. So we definitely wanted to target more like PC and console. And so we were looking more towards a global audience and maybe towards the West or stuff like that. And we kind of like our studio's DNA was like, we don't really care about the platform or the market. We first find out like what the game is and where it naturally fits. And then but like the things we were engaging with at that time were better fit for PC and console, and then there was no market for that in India at the time.
And what about like funding?
Yeah, there was no funding. So when we started off, it was completely bootstrapped. It was just like me and my partner and friend. We were just like living off of our savings and pouring hours into this game design and game pitch and like pitching to everybody around the world, publishers. And we got a publisher and we signed with them. But we couldn't, like, they went bankrupt fairly soon. So we couldn't really have so much capital or built up or like any funding. So then we then we realized like, okay, we need to take this dependency of a publisher and funding out. So we did a little bit of project work. And we did build up a little bit of like stability from that. And then we used that to fund our own game. And then we And somehow, like when we reached the second game, we were able to sort of like sustain from our own games.
And what was your market?
It was again global. Like we just figured out that we had to, since we pivoted from Nintendo DS, we started doing iOS because in 2007, I think, the App Store became open for developers to submit apps, and we were like, digital publishing was like, this could be our way of removing the dependency on the publisher to get the game out, because it was really difficult to get publisher contracts sitting in India. Like, we've never met these people, right? And why would they trust us? And then it's a huge expense to travel to meet these people as well, which we couldn't really afford. And like, so there was like a lot of things in the way of us getting good publisher deals. So self-publishing was good for us. And just like with PC and console, like the initial penetration for smartphones in India was abysmal. So we had to target globally. So it was mostly towards the Western market again.
And since the penetration was so low, like how come you and your partner had access to consoles and stuff?
I think my partner actually didn't have a console, but I had. Growing up, everybody had like these Nintendo knockoffs, and like the NES, but they were not officially made. They were like
pirated copies or something.
Yeah, like the pirated console. Actually, the hardware itself to run it was like. I think the one I played on was called Samurai or something. And it played NES cartridges, but wasn't actually an NES machine. And because Nintendo never launched in India officially.
Oh, they never did?
No. So we got these knockoff consoles, and we played Mario and Mortal Kombat. I mean, actually, when I played on Samurai for a while, and then like when Sega actually launched in India, and I remember like I really wanted the Mega Drive. And I think I saved up my allowance for a very long time and got like combined my birthday present for like a year and like somehow managed to get a Mega Drive. And when it was PlayStation, then the next console I had was PlayStation 2, which was also like I saved a bunch of stuff and like did some things to somehow manage to get a PlayStation 2. I missed the first one.
So that was also, it was not like all of your friends had consoles.
During the Samurai era, I think when we were much younger, a lot of people had consoles because it was kind of cheap as well. But like beyond that era, like as the consoles got more expensive and like as people were growing up and like people didn't have time for games, or like gaming was kind of like something only kids do, I guess. It kind of still is in India. Like the outlook is that only kids play games. So when you're like a little bit older, parents want you to focus and study on getting a good degree, getting a good job. And so no consoles for you.
Yeah. Do you feel it's a big difference between like the environment in Sweden and India in that sense?
Oh, hell yeah. I think like like India is extremely competitive school life wise. Like you're always kind of, whether you want to or not, you're like competing against everybody like all the time. It's very high pressure for kids, I think. Whereas here, I feel like kids can actually enjoy and be kids for a much longer time, which I think it's good. Yeah.
Yeah, I read that every year it comes out like 1.5 million engineers in India, which is crazy amount. That is like more than a tenth of the Swedish population.
Yeah.
And I suppose they have all studied quite a bit, and that's only engineers.
Yeah, there's a lot. Like I think that back in those days, and I think it's kind of similar. Like it's engineers or doctors. Those are the two main things you go for. Everything else is kind of like second tier almost in the parents' eyes. And then you can be like, I don't know, like architect and like everything else is like, oh, okay, you're good. Like try harder, sort of. And I'm not saying that that's true, but that's just how parents perceived it. So that there's a lot of pressure on kids to go become either a doctor or an engineer. Hence, we produce so many doctors and engineers.
But is it still like very hard to get into the schools, like the engineering school?
The top schools is hard. I think a lot of the top schools is really hard. But then there's a lot of schools. So then there's also like some private schools which are questionable a little bit. Some of them are very questionable, but like some of them are easier to get into because we have a lot of schools. But it's still competitive culturally in a sense. Like,
did you have this pressure on you, like to study hard?
I would think so. There was pressure on me to study and make something of my life. My father passed away when I was quite young. I was, I think, 15, maybe 14. So, and he had a business. And my sister, it was a very small business, but still enough to like run our family. My sister was the one who took over the business to put me through university and like let me finish my studies and stuff. So then there was obviously like there was a lot of like self-imposed pressure to make something of my life, but also culturally, like in general, like in the environment, there's always like a lot of pressure. Even the schools, the teachers, they're all geared towards like pushing you towards doing a lot and doing more stuff. So
do you think this is, I mean, game development is interesting because especially before, it hasn't been taken that seriously. And as you mentioned, like the parents maybe don't understand it. But it is also a very ambitious endeavor. It's hard. I mean, it's really hard to make a good game. So do you think it has been good for you to being brought up in an environment where a lot of people study hard, and then you can also kind of take that energy to work hard on your games?
Yeah, I think it definitely, I guess it didn't hurt. I never really thought about it that way. Like if that competitive culture helped us to work hard on our games, maybe it did. Yeah.
But you think it's more of a negative thing, or am I?
I mean, I think like the negative aspect is that kids don't get time to be kids. They're always right. But I guess like it is different, like it's a completely different culture, right? So like if you are living there, like maybe you're always a product of the culture. So if everybody around you is competing, somehow you're going to have to compete. Otherwise, but if nobody is competing, then it's less pressure for everyone to compete, right? So I guess like in that environment, we would have to compete. There's different grades to how much we do, but I guess so holistically, I feel like it's nice to let kids be kids for much longer than because they are going to have to grow up and get jobs and pay taxes and mortgages.
Yeah.
They don't have to worry about stuff too much when they're too young.
So if we compare, like one thing that is fairly common in Sweden during your university years is that it's quite common that you don't have that much time scheduled, and you also have the money for studying, so you can actually use that time to try out stuff. Like many people maybe join a theater group, or maybe try out some business, or maybe exercise their sport more. I mean, and also studying, and also it's also quite common that you actually don't study, but you have this kind of lee room to play around a bit. But it's not like that in India, or?
Not so much. Maybe a very small fraction can actually manage to do that. I think the education system itself is very different. Everything is about how high you score. So you're like always trying to get marks in your exams and like score better, and like so you get a higher grade. We have marks or points or whatever you want to call it, but it's like, so you're always trying to get these very high marks, get in the best university, so you have the best chance of getting the best placements at all of these, like Google, and everybody will come to the top universities and hire people, and not just Google, like all of these tech companies. And then there's always pressure to get high marks, so you get in the best university, and even there you have to get high marks. You're like considered for the top placement interviews, then you go for those placement interviews, and bam, you're in a job. And then like, so there's no like time where you have like, oh, I'm going to experiment and I'm going to like figure out what life is. And It's just very intense in that sense. So I guess and you're also like, I guess you could take student loans, but it's I think a lot of families will, having a loan in Indian culture is almost like it's the last thing you want. For a long time, people didn't have credit cards in India because like, oh, it's not your money. You shouldn't have it. You shouldn't spend it because you don't actually have this money. It's a loan. That's like a very bad thing to have. So it's like you would avoid even a student loan if you could. So most people would. And I don't think there's any government grants. I mean, I think there are scholarships that very few people can get. And like there are probably some grants that very few people can get. But majority people don't have any money to manage on their own. They're just like, yeah.
I think maybe we should learn something of that. At least we have so much loan here in Sweden. Like, it's crazy.
There's countries that's worse, I think. No?
Yeah, maybe some. Yeah. But yeah, we don't have that high student loans, but mortgages on the house and stuff.
Oh yeah, but that exists in, I think, globally, housing mortgages.
Yeah. So the gaming environment today in India, what has anything changed since you left it?
Since I left it, so when I started, it was very kind of different, right? Like as I said, there were very few studios doing something. But then we ran that studio for almost 10 years. And when I actually left India to move to Copenhagen, actually, where I was for a couple of years, by the time I left India, there was a significant amount of change, I would say. Like there were more studios, there were a lot of indies who were doing, I say a lot, but there were some doing interesting things. Some doing like very sort of like artistic games for museums, and like some doing like commercial games like us that were kind of like out of the run down path. I don't know how to say it. Some doing games that were off the beaten path, like, because like the beaten path in India was at the time had become like you either do something with cricket or like Bollywood, and like that games based on those things.
For the Indian market, then.
For the Indian
primarily.
Market. So, and like with varying results, like you will hear different versions of this story depending on who you ask, on how much money they make, because there's a lot of like inflating of numbers and like VC investments and stuff. So like if you want to get VC investments, you want to have high numbers. So a lot of people are going to like tell you very different numbers, but we saw very different numbers in our own experiences. So that was like the beaten path, like either do Bollywood, cricket, like, or like raise money from investors and like hire and grow. And that was like the thing to do. But there were like, I would say 10 or 15 people around India whose work was interesting to me. But like if you look at the scale of India, that's nothing.
Yeah.
But then 10 years back, there was nobody. We were kind of alone. So then in that sense, there was a lot had changed. And then from that point until now, I try to keep in touch with what's happening there. I feel some things have still changed. When I left India, there was not so much revenue coming from the Indian market, or like things were just beginning to change maybe there. Today, there is some revenue to be made in the local market as well. But it is still, a lot of it is still like off a beaten path, which has widened up a little bit. Like there's like today the beaten path is like a lot of like casino, card games, luck-based games. They do well in the local market. There's also like battle royales are doing really well in the Indian mobile market. Most of the market is still mobile driven in India today.
A lot of free-to-play stuff, or
pretty much only free-to-play stuff.
Oh.
And then there are still around 10 to 15 people whose work is kind of interesting and like doing stuff off the beaten path and like trying to do interesting things or artistically or like creatively or and then there's like there's still like a lot of investments and stuff being driven to the big machinery of games. But it's kind of interesting. I say that there is money that's being made there, but whether that's a huge amount or not, like, depends on how you look at it. Like, India is, I think, number 2 in the amount of downloads for mobile games or mobile apps. Which is pretty high. Like,
so what does that figure mean? Like the amount of downloaded apps by consumers, or?
Yes. So consumer mobile downloads, according to data.ai, in India, China is the biggest app downloads in mobile markets by downloads. Number 2 is India. Number 3 is the US in terms of just sheer downloads.
Yeah.
But when we look at consumer spend, like money that the companies are making, India is not even in the top 20 countries. So there's a lot of downloads being generated there, but there's not so much revenue being made there.
Got it. Is it also a lot of ads
yes,
within the games? I mean,
there's definitely ads in the game, and that might be contributing to the revenue. But I don't know if that can...
revenue
that's
of
harder
course,
to know.
It's of course lower, I suppose, like in the US because of the...
I would assume so. But also, like, that is harder data to find. So I don't really know. And again, like, that's where people say different things. But going by that number, like, if the potential revenue is lower, then the amount you can earn showing an ad is also going to be lower because the user quality, as they say in the mobile ad world,
quality
is lower.
That's a very nice euphemism right there.
Because they're less likely to spend, so they're worth less. I guess that's how the industry sees. It's not my opinion. It's not my statements. These are just terms people use in the industry.
I got it.
So it's kind of interesting. We do generate some revenue. That said, like in 2023, I think according to this data.ai's report, India generated $230 million in revenue. Yeah, but to compare that with like United States, they generated $23 billion in revenue, and like we're higher than them India is higher than them in terms of downloads. The distance in revenue is huge.
For sure. But also, what about the growth? Like, is it a fast growth
in India today?
Yeah, I mean, like, is the yearly revenue growing, or the revenue per user maybe is an interesting metric?
It's sort of not really. Like, I think in 2020 it was 210 million, and then it fell a little bit, it rose a little bit more, and now it's 230 million. So in 3-4 years, it's gone up by 20 million. So it's not that much growth, but it is some growth still. But then it also, like in the COVID years and post-COVID years, it dropped a little bit and then came back up a little bit. So it's like there's growth, but it's not like it was some years ago where there was explosive growth. It is sort of stabilized, at least the way I read this.
Yeah. Got it. But then, so you mentioned Bollywood games and cricket games being the more common ones.
This was back when I left India.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So now it's more the luck-based games.
Today, yes, like hyper casual does well, downloads wise. Yeah, simulation does well, downloads wise. Action does well, downloads wise. Revenue wise, again, I think the highest one revenue wise is shooting. Battle Royale is like the biggest chunk. Shooting in general does really well. Strategy 4X does really well. Yeah, and then like there's the luck-based games, party games, card games, and the casual match 3 games and stuff like that. They do well. There isn't that much. If you look at like the top grossing stuff in India, there isn't that much local content anymore. Or, well, there was never that much local content, I would say, actually generating that much revenue. But like it's a lot of the top grossing games are the usual suspects.
Yeah. Like Supercell games and stuff like that.
Supercell games are in there. PUBG PUBG was banned, and then they kind of remade it through a local company and relaunched it, and now that's doing really well. Call of Duty, another shooter. Then yeah.
But are there games being made locally that are in these genres that are the most popular ones?
Not in these genres. The local games that end up doing well are like, for example, in the casino genre, we have something called Teen Patti.
Mm-hmm.
Teen Patti. Patti is card, and teen is three cards. So it's basically it's a local poker-like game where you play with only 3 cards that are in your hands. That does really well.
And that's a digital version of something that's been around.
Yeah, for generations. Similarly, Ludo does well. It's an old board game, like an ancient board game that's just been around forever.
I wonder if that's Fia med knuff, the Swedish.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
With the 4 colors, like yellow, blue,
yes,
red, green.
Yeah, this one.
Yeah. That's
the
the one. Okay.
The digital versions of that kind of actually, these 2 games kind of changed the industry for India a little bit, on mobile at least. Like people actually started seeing that Indian games were making revenue, and these were the 2 kind of front running that.
Yeah, I suppose Ludo also works like globally.
I don't know how much money they get. I guess they do get some revenue from the Middle East, is what I heard, a lot of it. But I don't know how they do in the rest of the world. Like, I don't think they get that much revenue from other parts of the world. But in theory, it could work. But Teen Patti, not so much, because I think it's very much geographically in
Yeah. But are there any Indian-made games that you like? Like, do you have any examples of that?
I think there are games that I enjoyed, or like studios that I have followed and people that I have followed over the years. There was a game called Raji did fairly well internationally. I think it's by a studio in Pune. There was a game called Bonfire from a Bangalore-based team, and that game did very well on phones. It's like a survival game, I think. Personally, I've also enjoyed Lovely Planet, which is like this weird abstract shooter-ish game made by one guy in India. And there's another game called Fears to Fathom, which is like a horror game made by one person, mostly by one person. Now he's hired a few people. There's some interesting things coming soon, like a kind of slice of life narrative game called Fishbowl, which I have my eyes on. There is a studio called Oleomingus, and they do lots of very artistic games, mostly targeted at museums and art shows and stuff. But their games are really interesting to me, just from a consuming point of view. I think they do very cool things.
What do you have an example of what kind of game they are making?
I think it's been a while since I've played anything by them, but they did one about it's very hard. It was a narrative game that was post-colonialist. It's hard to explain. It's very abstract. I don't know if it's abstract, but it's very surreal, narrative-ish experiences rooted in some kind of Indian history or something like that. So I would love that, love that style and stuff.
Oh yeah, I'm going to put links in the description.
Yeah.
To this, that looks.
It looks really cool.
Almost long hand electric.
Yeah, I don't know how to describe this. what do I say?
Yeah, very beautiful environments, like very colorful.
Yeah,
and something that I suppose maybe it has some Indian influences. I don't know. But
yeah, definitely. I think they are talking about some. Yeah, they are narrative, puzzly kind of experiences, but they are talking about somehow about something coming from India, or like they have an identity that is very much about. But they're mostly targeting, as far as I know, and as far as I remember, they are mostly targeting like museums and art shows and stuff like that. And there's some more stuff happening in that space as well. Like another artist I recently discovered, Afra Shafiq, and also weird games about, but again, mostly for like art shows and museums and.
It might be hard to even get hold of the playable.
Yeah, it might be hard. Yeah, but it's always good to know that there's stuff like that happening. There's also another game that did fairly well on Apple Arcade that called Possessions, which I thought was quite interesting. So there are, like, again, as I say, like 10 or 15 games or studios and at any given time that I think are doing interesting things. But for a country that big, I think there needs to be more of us.
Yeah. But don't you think that will happen, like eventually?
It's hard to say, to be honest. Like the industry is, as you know, the industry is a hard place to survive. And there's a lot of churn. A lot of people, they try and, Indian have to do different things. Like, so it's no one's to blame, but that's just life, right? And so I don't know I don't know what is the critical mass and will it get there, or like, will we ever have like a stellar success from India that will jumpstart the Indian game scene in a really big way? I don't know. Like, maybe, hopefully.
Are there any big like AAA companies?
There are offshored studios. Sumo Digital has a studio there. Ubisoft has 1 or 2 studios there. I think Rockstar acquired a company there, I think, which was, I think it was briefly owned by Starbreeze. The Swedish. And when they got into financial trouble,
Starbreeze. Yeah.
They sold, like, when they were reconsolidating their operations in Sweden, they sold that offshore studio to Rockstar. I think Rockstar bought them out. So I don't know if they're still around. They probably are. But it's like a small art outsourcing. Not outsourcing, offshoring, I guess. What is that the right word when we have like a bigger company having it?
Yeah. Have you seen any of that? Because that is also like a huge thing in the tech, like software development, that you offshore stuff to India because there's a lot of talent and it's like cheaper.
Yeah.
Is that a thing in gaming as well?
Yes, but again, less so than tech. I think tech, there's a lot of it. I think games-wise, Sumo, Rockstar, Ubisoft are the ones that come to mind, which means there's probably a few more, but it's still not as much as Microsoft or Google or Adobe or Nvidia or stuff like that.
Have you experienced any of that, or have you seen any of that part of the business? Because I've heard this crazy stuff about, and this is when it comes to software, that people even have like a different daily rhythm, that you work during the night, so you have the same working hours as people in the Europe or the US and that type of stuff.
I've definitely heard of, and I know people in tech who do that. My brother-in-law, for example, has to do that for his tech job sometimes when he's working with clients in the US. But that's more like outsourcing studio, less so when it's an internal offshore, I guess. But consultancy studios also, they have to do that. I think even it's internal, like if it's a Google office, I think maybe I don't know so much. I haven't heard in games that they have had to do that. But then again, there's always like the usual problems like crunch and all that.
And do you think it will continue to be a huge pay gap between the West and India?
I think it still is somewhat of a pay gap. I think the gap is less drastic than it was some years ago, but it's still a pretty big difference. So I think it's going to get lesser and lesser over many years, but I don't know how long that period is. The economics of the world and of all the countries will come into play.
You don't have the answer to it?
I wish, but no. I mean, I think it's going to get a little bit lesser, but I don't think it's going to go away so soon, is my gut feeling.
But one interesting thing that has happened like the last 10 years when it comes to power is that I think the CEOs of Microsoft, Google, Adobe, IBM, and more companies are now Indian. Do you have any idea about why that is?
My simple answer is numbers. If every third no. I mean, I think there's some truth to that probably. Like there are a lot of Indians in the world, and we are eventually gonna.
It's like 1.3 billion or something. Or?
Yeah, I think it's more. I think it's 1.7. If I
1.7.
Yeah, let me.
Wow, you are many.
Yeah. 1.4 billion.
1.4, okay.
Yeah. 1.417 is India and 1.412 is China as of 2022. And I mean, that definitely means that there is like a lot of us out there. So but at the same time, it's also like, because a lot of we are producing a lot of tech people that are working in the industry, and like also a lot of them do tech and like business, and they are getting into all these roles. And it's only like because of like, yes, numbers, but also like the number of like people working in these industries and like moving out and like also finding jobs in these crucial roles, like, and growing from there. And so I think, it doesn't surprise me that it's happening, given the number of people we are and the number of people we produce in these industries. And more people are able to afford better education, go to better universities and get into these roles. And
you know, if there's also a lot of expats from India in the gaming industry, like in the West?
In the games industry, I think it's there are definitely, but I think compared to tech, much fewer, I would say. Tech is favored, as I said, like I think it comes from the parents' pressure to become like engineers or doctors and stuff. And it's also like they do that because they see that these are very safe jobs and you'll have a good life and have a decent salary if you are in these jobs. So like, I guess a lot of people actually end up living those lives, like being in tech. Games, there are definitely a lot of expats in games from India. I see them around and hear of them and like follow them, or like some people. I hear of them or like see them around at conferences or know of them. But I think compared to tech, it's fewer.
But how come you ended up not following like the regular path and actually starting your own thing and doing something a bit more risky, essentially?
I think as I said, like when I had that epiphany that I want to like end up making games, I remember that I had a chat with my dad about it, and he was like, whatever you do, you should do whatever you want to, and like if this sounds like something you can do, you should do it, but like make sure you like go through university, finish your studies, and like have a backup, and like then do whatever you want and try. And I think like that's what I remember like discussing later with my slightly older self as well, and like also with my family, and like I would like to try this, and like they were supportive, so I was a little bit lucky there, I think. But I think I would have done this anyway. Like, I enjoyed the idea of like the cross. Like there's so many skills coming together to make a game. Like it's so cross-disciplinary, and like everything kind of comes together in a nice way. I really enjoy that. And so I think that I always thought like, this is what I want to do in some way or the other.
But it was like from people around you and in general, they thought it was a strange decision?
Yes.
Or
some people thought it was like, what the hell are you doing? You're wasting your life, and like you're only going to get one chance to, get it right. And what the hell are you? You're stupid. And like, some people didn't understand, and a few people were like, okay, you're doing this now because it's going to be the thing tomorrow, so you're getting an early start. That's smart. But there were very few of those, and then like nobody really kind of understood why I wanted to, like very few people actually understood like why I wanted to do this. Like I guess peers who were with me in the industry had similar maybe feelings, but like people around us mostly, especially like parents and that kind of generation, they had all these strange ideas about what it was and why we wanted to do it.
And like if you see now you live in Sweden, in Malmö, and you see like how other Swedish game developers, like where they come from and how they have it. What are like the big differences that you see
between Sweden and India game developers?
Yeah, and like their backgrounds.
Yeah, I think it's very different times that I see it, right? Like I haven't seen Sweden 20 years ago or 30 years ago, but I feel like generally people are allowed to be themselves a lot more here. Like it feels to me, like I might be wrong, but it feels like there's less interference from family or like society on the whole about what you do with your life in Sweden. And I might be wrong in assuming this, but that's...
I think it's not zero, but I mean, I haven't lived in India, but from what you're saying, I think you're right, yeah.
Yeah, it feels like there's less pressure. And I think also like today, it's much different because like people who have kids that are like teenagers today have grown up playing games. So they understand that the industry, it is an industry and it has... there's jobs and there's like businesses to be made. There's like creativity. And so I think it's changed a lot. And I think there are a lot more people here who are supportive of people who want to do different off the path careers. People are more supportive of that here, I think.
Yeah, one thing that I almost find strange is that like in the 80s and the 90s, it was not common. It was clearly a subculture, but the demo scene that people... when they were maybe 12, 13, 14, they get together in some hall somewhere, took their computers with them and spent an entire weekend programming and making demos. And when that happened, the parents in general didn't understand what the hell their kids were doing actually. But they let them do it, and they were also under none or very little supervision as well. Do you know if anything like that happened?
No, not at all. Like I don't think there's so much of some... I think now there's like game jams and stuff and like hackathons for tech, but that's more like, it's very different, I think, from whatever I hear about the demo scene. I also heard like that computers came very early to Sweden, and like you were as a company, you were almost subsidized to give your employee a computer, and that like kind of jump started technical or computer literacy in a different way at a very early age to kids, which is also quite different in India, I think. Like we didn't have anything like that, and I think it became like a privilege to have a computer. So any of these things.
But I think it's kind of interesting with this because now it's a lot of discussions about TikTok and it's being bad for you, but also bad for your children. And I believe that, but I think it was a similar vibe around computers in the 80s and 90s. But still, parents apparently let them, like many people at least, spend a lot of time in front of their computers. And I'm not sure like where that trust came from, or if it's the same now or if it's different. I don't know. It's because that's the thing. When new tech arrives, you don't know. No one knows like if this is a good thing or a bad thing. And then like programming a Commodore 64, if you did that at an early age, that was probably like a super good for your career later on. But no one could know that in advance. And today, if you use a lot of TikTok, I don't know, maybe it could be a good thing. I mean,
it could be a good thing, maybe. But like the way I see it, like when you program something for the Commodore 64, you are creating something from you.
Yeah, but you could be creating like TikToks.
Yes, but depends on what. Like I feel like depends on what kind of content you create for those social media, it could be good for you, right? Like when I look at the Raka Raka channel on YouTube. There are these two kids, Australian, who made like VFX shorts for years, and now they're making movies in Hollywood. I don't know if it's Hollywood, but I think they made Talk to Me.
Movie?
Yeah, it's a horror movie. I think it's them. Hang on. And that's clearly come from them creating really good VFX in their backyards, right? On YouTube, which is kind of like, but it's about how they use that platform. They use it creatively to make something out of their selves. And now today they get the chance to make movies, feature-length movies. And I think that's, if you're using it that way, it's really good. But I think more of the fear comes from like influencer culture. Maybe people are afraid because there it's a little bit like, actually, I don't know. Like, yeah, I think you might be right. But I think it has to do a little bit with...
I should say that I'm very pessimistic about a lot of social media usage. But also, I like being the devil's advocate. Of course, you can also learn a lot from it and be creative and all of that.
Yeah.
And similarly, if you had a C64 and only played some dumb game for hours on end, that was probably not good for you in any meaningful way.
Yeah, I guess there's bad sides to every medium. But yeah, that's true. It was, but I was right. It's Raka Raka who made Talk to Me. It's a horror movie, and it's A24 that released it. So I mean, from being two brothers making YouTube videos about silly VFX things to having a feature-length movie deal, it's pretty big.
Yeah, for sure. And that is like the exact same thing as the demo scene and now making AAA games or something like that.
Yeah.
It's the same kind of process.
So I guess it could happen for TikTok or Instagram or whatever you want to pick. But I think that maybe the difference is if you're creating something out of your own and using this as a platform to showcase it, maybe it's different than consuming it all the time or like using it to... I feel like maybe the worry is that, and this is probably not even related to games, I think like the worry is like with the influencer culture, or like you're pushing yourself as a celebrity, or like not celebrity, but like it's about you that you're broadcasting to the world. You're not creating anything. You're like it can become a little bit narcissistic, or like it can feed into narcissistic traits. Yeah. Which is different from like, okay, use something to create something, and like...
Yeah, it's very different in that sense that it's so clear, like many views or likes or whatever is the high score that you are striving for. Whereas, let's say the demo scene, if you made something, maybe you wanted to win, maybe they had a competition, but that was a very small niche thing just among your friends or in that community that you ended up in. It's very different.
Yeah, creating something for creating it and like learning and putting it out there versus the motivation behind just like being famous. I think that's the danger maybe people want to avoid.
Yeah. And I know that you are cricket fan, and you mentioned that there are cricket games. Are there any good cricket games?
I used to be a cricket fan. I haven't watched so much cricket in a long time. I don't think there have been good cricket games in a very long time. I remember having fond memories of this Codemasters game called Brian Lara Cricket. But I mean, I don't know how much of that is nostalgia. I think it's a very complicated sport to get right in a video game. There are like cricket themed, or like just capturing a couple of aspects of cricket or one aspect of cricket and like making a game around it. That can be sometimes quite interesting. And actually some years ago, I bumped into a couple of Swedish brothers who made a game about cricket where you're the umpire or referee.
Okay.
And you have to... There's a very complicated rule in cricket called leg before wicket, or LBW. And they made a game about where you're the umpire and you have to guess, like just watch the ball that played out and say if you're out or not. And then the game tells you whether it fulfills all the conditions of being like before wicket. And you get a point or you don't, and then it's the next ball and the next ball. And I was so amused that, and I don't think they've ever played cricket. I don't think they have. But I was so amused that they made this. And it was kind of interesting. And I remember we adopted this approach at the studios that I was working at in India when we were making games on the feature phones. They were not very powerful. And we always tried to, if we have to make a cricket game on these low-powered devices, we always tried to make like something that were like capturing a small part of cricket.
Yeah. Makes sense.
And I think that kind of works. But I don't think there's been any really great cricket games that I can recommend.
I guess that's similar to, there are a lot of like penalty kick games in football, and that's like the equivalent of that in cricket, that you just pick one small chunk.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks again for coming here to Spelskaparna, Shailesh. It was great talking to you.
Thank you for having me again. It's been really nice.